Hey all, so I decided to take a look at our long piano wire, and this time instead of deflecting the tip, I'm going to be doing some modal analysis and then some periodic loading of the tip to kind of show off some of those modes we're going to find. So the setup is the same as before, same properties given to us by the manufacturer. The difference is in step, our next step is going to be frequency step. And after that is steady state dynamics modal. So before you do any kind of periodic loading in Abacus, you have to do modal analysis first. I'm not exactly sure why. Yeah, so for loading on this step, there's no loads applied to it. It is fully supported on the left side, and yeah, we added a boundary condition later. Here is it's called a secondary base. So I basically just define a point on this beam where my periodic loading is going to be applied. So once again, we won't be using that until later. Cool. So basically, modal analysis determines the resonant frequencies of a beam, and from what I could find online, it's basically an oscillating pattern of motion when all parts of the system move sinusoidally with the same frequency with a fixed phase relation. And these happen at very specific frequencies. So you can imagine the first mode for this beam would just be the tip oscillating up and down. The second mode, where all the beam would be oscillating in the same pattern, would be kind of like a U shape. It would bow in and out. The next part would be a sine wave, and so on and so forth. A sine wave and a half. Yeah, so let's go ahead and run this. It's really easy to set up modal analysis. You just make that step and it kind of does the rest for you. Show you one more thing. So for mode, if I edit this step, we're given a few options here. Like I said, to calculate modes, it's pretty fancy math. It uses like mass matrices, eigenvalues. I definitely have to do some brushing up to fully understand that. But here you define how many modes you want to find. And then here you define the maximum frequency of interest that you're interested in. Cycles over time, I believe, is 1 over second, so it's in terms of hertz. That's at least how I understood it. So basically, it's going to search from 0 to 150 hertz and find the first 4 modes inside of that. Go ahead and run this. Also, I'm using beam elements, and there's 50 elements along the line. I use 50 because we're going to end up with quite a few waves going through our part, and I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any issues with the mesh. So let's take a look at the results. So you can kind of visualize it. This magnitude doesn't actually mean anything. There's no loads applied to it. So this is kind of an arbitrary value. If you take a look at the animation, you can see Abacus likes to blow the scale factor out of proportion initially. So I'll go ahead and change that so it's a little easier to see. Okay, so you can see all of the first 4 nodes that it's finding in this frequency range. So if you start off at the back of the first frame, first mode doesn't look like it's doing anything. This would be oscillating up and down, so the part would actually still be in the shape of a line. That's why it just looks like that. Next mode, you can see kind of that bow shape that I was talking about. It's going to bow up and down. The next mode, first it's a sine wave. So if you oscillate this fast enough, it'll now start to propagate a sine wave through it instead of going up and down. Next wave, 3 humps in the sine wave. And finally, the last one that I tested for, you can see there's 4 humps. And so we needed to do this. This helps us understand how our system would pattern it would vibrate at, and then also we need it to do our periodic loading. And so Abacus on the document actually spits out a nice little piece of information. The eigenvalue, I believe, has to do with kind of how intense those modes are. You can see the mode number. This first mode is essentially 0. It appears to be a rigid body mode. From my understanding, that doesn't really mean much. You can see the first mode is going to happen at 1.02 hertz, and that's it oscillating up and down. That's actually not too far off from what we calculated in class. I believe we had 1.23 hertz, so that makes sense. The next one would happen at 6.89 hertz. That's that hump, and then 22 hertz, a sine wave, 46 hertz, a sine wave and a half, and 79 hertz, 2 sine waves. So now that we've seen how we expect it to vibrate, I'm going to use a cool feature called Modal Dynamics. So let me go ahead and re-enable this step here. So what's really cool about Modal Dynamics is instead of giving it an input, I know, so for Abacus, you can give it an input, kind of like a time history. Here, actually, I'll go ahead and explain this first. So steady state dynamics modal, you got a few options here. You have your lower frequency, your upper frequency, and then the number of points you want to basically simulate in between those. So the way I have it is between every hertz there's 10 points, so 1500 points, 150 frequencies we're testing. And then this part's important. You have to give it a damping ratio. If you were to oscillate the system at one of those resonant frequencies without a dampening ratio, it basically just explodes. It keeps gaining energy, and I was playing around with it before. You'll see this piece literally, no matter what you have your deformation factor set at, it'll just go completely out of the screen and break your model and have issues. So I'll go ahead and add a dampening ratio. In the real world, you would see a damping ratio for systems between like 1% and 5%, so we'll go with 1% as like a conservative value to show off its deformation. Now here's a really cool part about modal dynamic analysis is instead of giving it, so basically what I'm doing to kind of show off these modes is I'm going to displace this tip up and down at different frequencies and see how the rest of the system responds. And so normally what you could do is give it kind of a time history input. So you could say at time 0, I want it here. At time 1, I want it here. At time 2, I want it here, which is good for moving it. But the issue with that, if you want to move it at a range of frequencies, that would be really hard to input as kind of a time frequency. So this modal dynamic analysis allows you to to displace it at a specific frequency as opposed to giving it like a time history. So if you take a look at this boundary condition called BC3 here, it's a displacement base motion. So earlier I defined with BC4 that this point right here is my base, and so whenever I make a displacement base motion boundary condition, it's going to be applied to that point. So if we take a look here, you can choose which degree of freedom you want to be displacing. You choose where on the part, which base you are displacing, and then you have to give it an amplitude. So I created a sine wave basically to show this off. So creating an amplitude, there's a lot of different options here. Mine is very simple. It was just a sine wave that changes in frequency. So I used periodic, and then add a few things here. So it's kind of hard to tell just based on filling out a table what your input's going to look like. You can see the amplitude. I'll show you what I did here. I gave it a magnitude of 0.05. So basically, I believe this has to do with the magnitude of it. It's going to be displacing 5 centimeters up and 5 centimeters down, and starting at 0. But it's kind of hard to tell what we're looking at. So Abacus has a really cool tool in the plugins called Amplitude Plotter, and you can take a look at what your wave actually looks like. So you can see here, like I mentioned, it's going to go 5 centimeters upward, 5 centimeters downward. And I believe the frequency for this is kind of arbitrary. So what it's going to do is it's going to use this sine wave and it's going to vary its frequency through all those ones I requested. So at first it's going to have a sine wave with a frequency, I'm going from 1 to 1500 hertz. So first it's going to be a frequency of 1 and oscillate our system with this wave with a frequency of 1, and it's going to step up all the way up to 150 hertz. So as opposed to having to make some crazy time accelerate or time displacement input, I can give it this, and this Abacus knows to step through and use this sine wave at all those frequencies I requested, which is pretty cool. I don't know what's going on here. Let's go over to job. So I'll go ahead and submit this one. Takes a second to run, but we should be able to see all of those vibrational modes that we learned about earlier through our modal analysis. And so one thing I've noticed is I believe the modal analysis is on an undamped system, and I don't know that it's necessarily just shaking the tip up and down, because when I was running this analysis, actually, I found those mode shapes were the same as what I found earlier. The way that it vibrates looks exactly like it did when we were taking a look at the modal analysis, but it didn't necessarily happen at the exact frequencies I specified. So my hunch is that only shaking the tip isn't necessarily what modal analysis had in mind, and then also it's an undamped system, so adding some damping to the system kind of moves these around a little bit. But in just a second we should be able to see the results. Okay, yeah, 1500th iteration. Take a look at the results. Okay, this is what we want. So here I'm going to have to crank up my deformation factor to show what we actually want. I'm not sure what A is. We'll take a look at displacement. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. Modal. I think I've got the wrong viewport open here. Okay, perfect. Yep. So this is showing our periodic step. I don't know how I got on that modal step before, but take a look at the displacement of it over time. And also, so the frames here, there's 1500 frames, and we step through 150 frequencies linearly. So if you divide the frame number by 10, that's the frequency that the tip is oscillating at that point. I think visually it might just look like the tip is kind of moving up and down at a steady rate, but each frame it oscillated it at that frequency. And we'll see that here. So you can see right now nothing interesting is happening, the tip's just moving up and down. Let me turn up the deformation so we can see it a little easier. Cool. So you can see nothing of interest here, just going up and down. Now we're starting to get that bow shape that we expected, and you can see it's starting to resonate with that big jump up there. So that happened at about 19 hertz on our model. So So what's interesting is we do have a mode at 22 hertz, which is pretty close to that. It wasn't that exact shape, and I'm not entirely sure how modal analysis translates into something like this, but it did happen around that frequency. Keep it playing. You can see the system start to kind of get dampened out. You can see the tips moving more than the rest of the system, so we're kind of in between resonant frequencies right now. And then we should start to see a sine wave slowly appear and then kind of get out of control for a second once it starts to resonate. So right now we're at 40 hertz. We should have a mode at 46 hertz, so we'd expect something real soon. Yep. And then boom, see it start to kind of get out of control there. That was at 49 hertz, pretty close to the 46 hertz that we saw in our modal analysis. That's the 2 humps. Next we should see 3 humps starting to form. You can see the system getting dampened out again. And you can kind of see a 3rd hump starting to form here. And there you can see the system starting to get out of control. And that happened at 71 hertz. We had an expected resonant frequency at 79 hertz. So once again, not spot on, but pretty close. And then, yeah. I don't think we have another resonant frequency for a while. Our system just kind of noodles around until it gets to that 1500 hertz range. But I'll turn up the deformation here. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 humps oscillating back and forth now. So this is kind of showing off the modes. Like I said, a mode is an oscillatory pattern in which all parts of the system move sinusoidally with the same frequency, and you can see that happening with our system. Magnitude clearly changes as you get away from the tip, but in all those different modes you can see them oscillating at the same frequency. So there's a lot you can do with this stuff. In the real world, you would want to do some modal analysis and vibrational loading. This happens a lot with buildings, so you would want to make sure that your building doesn't have any resonant frequencies that it might experience during an earthquake, and if it is, you want to make sure that your building doesn't turn into a U-shape like our piano wire did. So yeah, this tool's super useful. There's a lot more you can do with vibration and periodic loading and all that I didn't dive into, but yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to show off.